koutou, ko te mea tuatahi, he mihi mahana, he mihi nunui, ki taku hoa, ki o tātou manuheri a Shane Webster. He tangata whenua o Aotearoa ia, no te iwi o Torres Strait Islands. Tēnā koe kare, nau mai hare mai ki Rarangatira. Kia koutou, te hunga pukamata, tēnā koutou, nau mai hare mai kia koutou katoa. Ko Tānia Pauwhare ahau no ngai tūhoi. E kai mahi au, kai te kaunihira o Tāmiki Makaurau, kai ngā tima Southern and Western Initiatives. Welcome to the first live stream, Rangatira kōrero. We're streaming this on 2 Facebook pages, He Waka Eke Noa and the Southern Initiative and Western Initiative. My name is Tānia Pauwhare, and I have the great pleasure of working across all 3 of those projects. For those of you who don't know the Southern and Western Initiative, we are the Social and Community Innovation Department at Auckland Council. Our job is to support, facilitate and enable innovative ways to unleash the economic and social potential of South and West Auckland. He Waka Eke Noa, which is based in the Western Initiative, connects buyers and clients like Auckland Council to Māori and Pasifika-owned businesses and promotes supply diversity and development in Aotearoa. And we're not just in Tāmaki Makaurau, we are increasingly across the motu. And tonight it's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Shane Webster, a Torres Strait Islander brother and tangata whenua of Australia. Shane's the General Manager of Regions at Jarwin, an organisation which connects professionals from the private, public and third sectors into secondments with Indigenous organisations to work on Indigenous identified and led projects. But Shane also has his Indigenous fingers in lots of pies and will be yarding our way through a fairly wide range of issues over the next hour. I'm going to let Shane introduce himself shortly, but how I know Shane is that he and I spent 60 days together last year as fellows on the Atlantic Fellowship for Social Equity, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island-led fellowship program focused on Indigenous epistemology, a fellowship that is part of a wider global network of the Atlantic Fellowship funded by the incredible generosity of Chuck Feeney, that is creating a network of change agents across the world in a wide range of equity issues. Spending a lot of time with 16 to 20 other people for 10 days at a time, day in, day out, all day, and working on some pretty heavy issues whilst also juggling work and family was at times pretty tough going. But Shane was indefatigable. He was relentlessly positive. He put a lot of effort into creating a really positive group dynamic. He's also really smart, generous with his social capital, inquisitive, futuristic, and also a lot of fun to be around. So that said, Shane, thank you for joining us. And can you tell us a couple of interesting things about yourself?
I can. What a wonderful introduction. Thank you. Kia ora, everyone. Look, a couple of things about me. I think when other people introduce you, it's always a bit of an outside of your body experience. It's wonderful to hear yourself described in that way. If you ask my wife, she would say, Shane has a few other more adjectives to attach to that. But look, a couple of interesting things about me. Right now, I'm live streaming from Little Adelaide, which is the sister city of Christchurch, which is actually where I used to live when I was a lot younger, just outside of Christchurch. You may have noticed I look a little bit different from the wonderful advertisement that was released. So I am sporting what is now colloquially known as the COVID cut, where it's sort of the home coronavirus cut. So, a little bit more sleeker, but not sure how I feel about it. And what else can I say apart from that wonderful introduction? I've spent a considerable part of my life working in the Indigenous affairs space, primarily around helping communities shape their future by choice, not chance. I think that's one of the fundamental issues we deal with when we think about the words empowerment and self-determination. It's those who hold the power are not willing to hand over the keys and share some of that power. And that's ultimately where I think a lot of the contact zone comes from. So happy to talk more about that tonight. And what else can I say? I also enjoy myself on the Atlantic Fellowship. What Tanya is not letting you know is that, there were 16 to 20 of us, but Clearly, I'm a favourite, so I'm happy to wear that crown. Apologies to anyone else who sees it.
Don't tell the others.
Don't tell the others.
Oh, awesome, Shane. It's really great to see you. I miss you, Mob. So you guys, you've been hit. You're only just getting over the immediate trauma of bushfires, and then COVID-19 hits, and your country's had like two big traumas happen. How are Indigenous people and Indigenous communities holding up and faring with these kind of like, back-to-back fairly catastrophic events?
Look, it's May, and it's just one of those years where you're constantly looking around the corner for what's coming next, because it has been quite difficult. Look, I think the loss of biosecurity late last year, or actually for a 4 to 5 month period, to be honest, was devastating. It hurt a lot of people. It hurt us significantly more because of our connection. But I think one of the great things to gently sort of bubble up out of that was this idea that, hang on a second, there were people living here for a long time and they managed these sorts of issues. How did they do that? So that's a question that always bubbles along, but it was one that began to mainstream. And what was really amazing from my point of view is while that was really happening on the East Coast, that's sort of bubbling away. On the West Coast, it's a completely different story. We've got, cool burning or cultural burning, cultural fires, which are actually best practice in the West Kimberley, just outside of Broome. And, our brothers and sisters in the West Kimberley are actually, they were while Australia was burning on the East, they were over in Africa, teaching the Africans who have lost part of their stories and their way and their cultural practice around burning fires. And so, it's sort of like there was a dichotomy of, we're seeing ABC presentations on what's happening in the West overseas and that recognition occurring. And at the East, it's like, oh, hang on a sec, maybe we've got some of this knowledge here. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing, which has been interesting, and it's been received in different ways and different elements. The initial fear that was driven by the need to shut down really panicked a lot of people. There were one of the media messages, and the media carries a lot of messages, but body bags of children were sent to communities. Now, whether that was particularly a distinct response from Indigenous communities as opposed to other communities, I'm not sure about, but certainly in the way it was perceived and received, people were in panic mode, and it was at a time when they couldn't go to the shops and stock up on hand sanitizer and toilet paper and all the things that they need as their first line of defense. So there was a lot of suffering, a lot of pain there. The other thing is what it's allowed people to do is really center themselves in their family and their relationships through the lockdown. So for the most part, I think people have enjoyed that. The sort of the standing still and hearing the birds and breathing the air. Like, I think that's been a good thing. And we often talk about that perhaps being a new way forward, but really it's the old way forward. So I think that's been interesting as well. But look, I'm knocking on wood right now. Let's not have any more of this. Let's take a break. I'm happy to take a break in the last 2 quarters of this year.
Yeah, and for things just to go smoothly and no more dramas. Yeah. So I know that you're a big fan of the Indigenous procurement policy, which the federal government there introduced in 2015, and of Supply Nation, which He Waka Eke Noa is based on. And you were involved in the development of the South Australian states and Indigenous procurement policy as well. When I talk to people here about what's happening in Australia, they often don't believe me, and they have trouble believing actually about how far in advance Australia is compared to here. And because by any measure, it's been a success. Going from $6 million federal spending and before the policy to only kind of like 5 years later, more than $2 billion. And our mate Heath Nelson is one of the best in the business at Indigenous procurement. So what do you think are the potential opportunities and risk now through the Indigenous procurement policy for Indigenous businesses? Like, are we going to see a contraction in public spending? Are we going to see a default to perhaps pre-Indigenous procurement policy buying behaviour from the public state? Or actually, is this going to open up a whole other new world for Indigenous businesses? And also, what are Indigenous businesses kind of feeling just generally about the state of the economy?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, and it's one a lot of people are thinking about quite a lot at the moment. Look, I think it's important when we talk about the IPP. You're right; it is one of the few success stories that occur in this country, and really, I think we need to talk about there are almost two IPPs. There was what initially started in the corporate sector, which was a corporate-led response. So as you mentioned, people like Heath Nelson at Fortescue Metals Group and others were really pushing this idea of, more than CSR, more than corporate social responsibility, but sort of your own liberties tied to the liberty of all citizens. And then underlying tone of capitalism and greed, and how can we turn these group of people into paying customers? That's always never far behind, but it's there. And then the government, as a lag as it is, it slowly caught onto it and adopted it. And then the sleeping giant awoke. And then, as you said, we went from 6 million to over 2 billion. So look, I always think of this as two speeds. I think the government approach will continue to maintain quite strongly. And I think it'll slow down a little bit slower as well. Whereas I think corporate responds, it's market-based, so it needs to respond quite quick. So if you look at the COVID response, it's actually been the corporate sector that's had the sort of best or quickest response, or I guess pivot to the situation that's occurred. So with the help of Supply Nation and others, they've had roundtables. They're really going through the supply chain. They're looking for which of their current Indigenous suppliers that might be particularly affected by what's happening. You're seeing where, and this is a big question mark, but you're beginning to see where it's possible an increased focus on cash flow, so reduced payment times if it can be done. I know some of the organisations we're working with who are sort of tourist-based operators, they're striking out deals with their long-term clients to prepay bookings in advance to help maintain cash flow. And so that was quite important, and that was the initial response that occurred in this country. And then the government came in with what's called its JobKeeper payment system. So that provides payments to most employers to keep their employees on the books. There's criteria around that. And what's interesting is that where you had sort of the Supply Nation type commercial operators, Indigenous businesses, I think that's been useful. It's interestingly sort of the plague, we often call it, of year-to-year funding cycles for more of the social services sector in the Indigenous space. Right. They haven't had the same impact because they're funded an annual cycle. So, a lot of people in that space actually had some job security, whereas it's often the other way around, is they have the least amount of job security because they're living from funding cycle to funding cycle. So that's been interesting as well.
Yeah. And and actually, just a quick note, why it looks so dark is because my light has broken and I need an electrician. And under these circumstances, it's pretty tricky. And this is the first kind of live that our team has done, and I am like the least competent person to be doing it, technologically challenged. So just apologies in advance if things go terribly wrong, but we are recording it and we are going to be able to see Shane in perpetuity on the internet. Thanks, Shane. So one of the, I keep coming, what I really love about supply diversity is where it came from. And, the concept and the practice has a really special history. It emerged from the civil rights movement as a vehicle for economic justice, economic inclusion, and economic equity for people who had been discriminated against and essentially locked out of the economy, let alone the ability to own and operate enterprises and businesses. How do you see supply diversity? Because that's always the story that I tell. And to what extent has Indigenous procurement in Australia garnered a movement for growing Indigenous entrepreneurship, greater market share for Indigenous businesses, as well as at the same time showing that there is a different way of being able to do business, that it holds your Indigenous values and is also sustainable. So is it more than just improving equity through a supply and demand mechanism? Is this actually part of what our fellow Daryl would talk about as being part of nation building? And, is it a way in which Indigenous people can realise sovereignty and self-determination?
Yeah, look, I think that's an excellent question. And I think it's right to reference and respect the origins of this overseas. And I think one of the unfortunate parts of this country is we're always decades behind in our relationships with our First Nations. So that's an important context to understand here as well, because in the 60s, so our late 60s, the civil rights movement here led to a constitutional change around which was a highly supported referendum around getting counted in the census and a particular power of the Constitution to make laws for Indigenous peoples. But what that actually did is it sort of ended segregation. So all of a sudden you could go to the pub and you didn't need your dog tag or your white card, your Aborigines exemption certificate. You could marry who you wanted to, et cetera, et cetera. But it also opened up something we don't often talk about, and it allowed people to, set up organisations themselves for the first time, to manage their own mission-based communities quite often, and to go to school past year 6 in a lot of regional towns. And so you saw sort of the first wave of people go into organisations, or not businesses, organisations which were there to support their people. So the health sector, progress associations, race relations centres, that's where we saw a lot of the effort. And then the next generation had the ability and the freedom, loosely freedom, but the ability to go to school a bit longer. They were, at the very beginning of intergenerational wealth transfer. They may have had a car passed down to them or something small. They began to acquire property. And then what happened, so you sort of had the freedom education movement. And then what we're seeing now is what I like to think about is the freedom to trade. That's a huge policy implication, which we're still grappling with in this country. Right now, there's actually, native title has been significantly determined across this country. Native title is a form of rights, which is a very watered down form of rights, usually around access and negotiation. And a lot of this country right now has native title determination over it. So there's a lot of land-rich communities and cash-poor situation, which you may or may not be familiar with. And so what's happening right now is there is sort of middleware I like to think about in the IT space, where you've got a lot of operators who are not Indigenous-led, who are managing those portfolios. There's a lot of restriction and red tape around the ability to access those trust funds, which is huge. So we're almost creating like the passive poor right now. These determinations have occurred and people can't access it and use it for their own nation building. So to answer your question, I think we are, the fight and the energy is appropriately in this space right now around the freedom to trade. We're seeing a new generation emerge where, they have ability to go into the higher education sector and come out of that. They have possibly a house or, more than a house passed on to them. So you're seeing intergenerational wealth. And certainly in my role at the moment, where I work with about 70 Indigenous organisations, primarily right now to access the market, we're seeing a very big upsurge in communities creating their own economies. This is much more than sort of cottage industries. We're talking about really big players. We're talking about exporting wildflowers to Japan and China. We're talking about exporting pippies or cockles over to Portugal. We're seeing some really big things begin to emerge. And what's underpinning that is two things. It's three things. It's the IPP is creating a bit of a supply chain momentum. It is the it is where the fight needs to be because of the restriction on freedom right now. And it's the historical legacy of people only now being able to have the asset base and the education available to them to compete in the same way that they're being excluded previously. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. What's really going to play, and I think this is the unfortunate thing right now, is what I'm hearing in my network is spring is going to be a really horrible, difficult time for us in this country. Right now, what's keeping us afloat is stimulus and safety nets in the form of JobKeeper payments. Yeah. When that ends and we return to normal, a lot of people are expecting a really slow laggard economy that's going to really hit hard in spring, and then people are going to hit those dole queues and people are going to hit those jobless lines, and it's going to be a really, really slow recovery. And unfortunately, in this country, our interest rates are low as they can. They're pretty much close to zero. So we don't have a lot of policy levers. Yeah, we don't have a lot of policy levers to be able to just go, hey, let's fix this and get things back on track that we had in previous recessions and previous hard economic times. So, how we respond to this is going to be really key. And particularly as we do it as a community as well, it'll be interesting to watch.
And just following on from that, Shane, I don't know if these conversations have been happening in Aussie within Indigenous communities, but there's been a pretty resounding call from Māori here that we don't want to go back to pre-COVID-19 conditions because that economy was failing our people. It was absolutely suboptimal. And we now have a once in 100-year opportunity to do a reset to a fairer and a greener economy. How can Indigenous peoples and our leadership and our values and our ways of doing and knowing contribute to that endeavour of building back better?
I think that's the question right now for us all, isn't it? Do we go backwards or do we go forwards? Do we go back to what we were, or we do create the new? And I think, I'm getting a sense across the sea that you guys are thinking about that and coming to terms with that, and you have a leadership that's supportive of that. Unfortunately, I think there was talk of her joining our national cabinet at some point. I
think that's happened. I think that happened. I'm behind on my news, but I'm totally supportive of that. Yeah, totally supportive of that.
I think, and I'm not criticizing anyone here, but I think when you look at the media rumblings, we are talking about things like a fossil fuel-led recovery, supporting the gas industry, supporting the coal industry. That's bubbling out through the media. If you look at the people who are leading the charge around that economic recovery, there are highly credentialed, very experienced operators, but a lot of their bailiwick comes from that particular industry. So I'm not surprised to see people clinging to what they know. That's what we all do. But I think the other question there is, at the local level, I'm also seeing some really cool things emerge because of this restriction around movement. So in places like Cape York, we're seeing, particularly one small community of Hopevale, it's pretty incredible. We're seeing, local non-Indigenous farmers needing access to a supply chain. And we're seeing like the local community take over the logistics and take over the supply chain and creating markets and sort of food markets and food delivery boxes and really filling a need. And that's incredibly interesting to be watching right now. And I'm wondering if that's going to continue on into different spaces. What's difficult right now is, you're right, we have a group of people in this country, and certainly in yours, that have a way of viewing the world that could absolutely help with some of the solutions we need right now. COVID is just it's the minnow, it's climate change and the destruction we're having to the world. That's right on the back corner there waiting for us. Yeah. And while we're giving the earth a bit of a respite, if we go back to what we did, we have to deal with that and come to terms with that. And it's going to be hard. I think we've certainly got the answers. I think we've got that ingenuity, we've got the creativity, and we've got the Indigenous ways of knowing and being, which can be supportive of that. But in this country right now, if it's not freedom to trade, the other big movement right now is just having a voice, and that's a really difficult battle for us.
And I think you know, it's difficult when you don't have voice, and voice often equates to power. So, you know, and power usually gets its way. And so if it's the old type of economy, there are really high vested interests in returning to the pre-COVID conditions. So how might we be able to use some of those fantastic examples that you've just given? I think one thing that's also in common here is the idea of localism has really surfaced, and the idea that, you know, how might we shorten our supply chains for really kind of basic human rights, for example, around food, and how might we be able to kind of create different markets and different types of exchange. And yeah, I'm hopeful and optimistic that we, you know, might come out with a better economy than what we went into with this, in terms of, you know, being equitable and being fairer to people, and also better for our planetary life system. And it's going to be a tough fight.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know about your country, but I think when we've had big progress in the last decade, it's really been in partnership with the corporate sector. It's been the corporates that have made the commitments to, you know, divest out of fossil fuels. It was the corporates that led the IPP. And, you know, there is an emerging, mature relationship now between Indigenous Australia and corporate Australia. And I think when you look at investment and you look at direction, you know, in the past, it was often we would have a project and that project would underpin the relationship between us. But I think going forward, we have the relationship now, and I think that's going to underpin the projects. And I think that's probably the light at the end of the tunnel. It's the shining gem here.
One of the things that I'm really interested in, and this would be my dream come true, is, you know, how might Indigenous businesses, you know, across the Tasman and also Trans-Pacific, you know, bringing in our Pacifica brothers and sisters as well, how might we start to not just even trade amongst ourselves, but actually join venture and start to be able to take on the big end of town? You know, what I've always kind of thought about, oh God, what would that look like? You know, if some of our kind of like really big construction and civils businesses started to get together, we might actually have a chance.
Yeah.
You know, it really.
Look, I think there's some really easy wins here. I think if we're seeing, let's put ourselves aside for a second. I think if we're seeing corporates that are sort of trans-Tasman in their operations, who are beginning to live and breathe our values, and forming relationships, then I think that's an easy win. I won't name any in particular, but I can certainly think of some in the insurance space, in the civil construction space, where that's occurring. And I think that's the competitive advantage. If you can have that trans-Tasman link between the existing foothold in the sector, then I think that's how it starts. It's not where it ends, but I think that's how it starts. And then as our capability and our ability to engage across, you know, vast distances increases, then I think that's the next stage from that. I don't think it's a good idea to do it all at once. I think it's, you know, sort of find a stepping stone approach to do it. But it's there, and I think it'll happen. I think it'll happen organically, but organically is too slow. So we're going to have to speed it up.
Yeah, we're going to have to leap, right? Because I think, and then that has been one of the frustrating things that we've experienced is we do have a lot of very big businesses who are actually domiciled in Australia, and they are here, and we hear about the things that they're doing in Australia around Indigenous procurement, but it's not translating into the way that they're doing business here in New Zealand. I think we're starting to get some traction on that, but you know, it has been a wee while now, at least a couple of years since we've been, you know, kind of talking to those businesses. Look, you're doing it in Australia, why aren't you doing it here? And we're still not quite getting that cut through. So we'll keep fighting on that one. Oh, Shane, you look like you're frozen, but we've got some technical difficulties. Let me know when you can hear me, Shane. Sorry, folks, this is entirely predictable. With my technological ineptitude and with the fact that actually the technology's not been working very well, was anticipating this. Hopefully Shane will be back with us as soon as possible. Seem to be having some internet problems. I hope that you've been enjoying the kōrero. Oh, I think Shane's back in. Hopefully we'll be back. There we go. Welcome back, Shane.
Sorry.
Look, it was bound to happen, right? It is what it is.
Can you hear me? And sound check. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, good, great. Well, I can. I'm not sure about you know, Facebook, but yeah, as long as you and I can hear each other, that's probably a good start.
Okay.
I know that you've got a particular interest in indigenising the fourth industrial revolution, and an interest in all things Wakanda. And what I particularly like about that is that nexus between ancient Indigenous knowledge and, you know, Indigenous leadership, technology, futurism, and all with a bit of, you know, sci-fi thrown in there as well. Can you describe for us and what your vision of an Indigenous Wakanda is? You may want to just briefly explain. Not everyone may know what the fourth industrial revolution is, so maybe just start off with that and then launch into what the next Black Panther that we could get Taika Waititi to direct, by the way, what the next Wakanda can look like.
I think it's showing your inner nerd, inner geekiness that you say, oh, maybe people don't know what the fourth industrial revolution is, but everyone will know what Wakanda means.
I just assume that people are, you know, popular culture. Everyone knows Marvel.
Look, I'll start with Wakanda quickly. So for those who haven't heard of Wakanda, it came out of the Marvel comic series. But what's interesting about it, it's the most advanced, technologically advanced civilization in the world based out of Africa. But what it stands for, it's the unconquered nation. And so that's the dream, that's the goal, right? Is how do you become the unconquered nation and use technology to your benefit? And what's really interesting is it's got this particular natural resource in the form of I think it's a comet or an asteroid that landed, vibranium. That's it. And the way it chooses to exploit its own natural resources is really interesting. It's almost they don't trade it; they keep it to themselves, and they have a different relationship with them, which is also really cool. But to answer your other question, in the fourth industrial revolution, I think that's a lot of words, and sometimes it can put people off. But I think what's really the way I've always thought about this is, whenever there's particular alignment in the industrial movement of countries and nations and the private sector, I'm always, I get excited by it, but I'm always got one eye on what's going on, because the reality is, Indigenous peoples have never put their hand out and said, come conquer me. That's what I want. Colonization tends to occur in sort of short sprints, short destructive ugly sprints, if I can even use the word sprints. And, when you look back in colonization, I often think about it as sort of, there's been 5 waves. There was the age of discovery, people sailing around the world. You had the next stage of that, which was for gold and glory, looking for treasure and minerals to exploit. And then the last... to extract and, that's capitalism
right. to build and breed and...
Yep. And then we saw and the last 4 being industrial. It's, the steam revolution. We saw that, in Australia, we saw that particularly strongly. It was actually the steam paddles along the Murray River going from, effectively from Sydney to Adelaide, where a lot of that sort of massacre and settler contact occurred. We had the industrial revolution around electricity, which was, particularly... It was the mass industrialization that occurred with that. and the ocean environment, and sort of the move towards more of a urban landscape rather than a agrarian landscape. And then we saw in our recent life, and the other thing about industrial revolutions, they keep to double in speed. So the computing revolution, I think everyone who's listening to this was either born digital or born analog, or you're like me, a bit of a cusper, where you went through both. Still remember the old phone, like the analog phone.
The one with the face.
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one.
Well, I grew up, and this is because I lived in a very, very rural area where it was a party line. So the entire road had one phone line, and you had to pick it up to see if someone else was on, and if they were, they'd get off. Then, to ring, you had to use Morse code.
Oh, so really?
It was like, yeah, we were probably one of the last places in New Zealand to actually get push phones. Anyway, I've distracted you, but
anyway, so we went from analog to digital, and then what we're seeing right now, and most people are in agreement right now, but we are at the very beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, and that the best way to describe it is it's actually a merging of humanity and technology. So it's about intelligence, it's around biotechnology, our genomes, our data sovereignty. It's around the ability to police state to monitor people. That's one side of the fence. But the other positive side of the fence is about e-health. It's about artificial intelligence. It's about access to skills and advice that you might have been excluded to previously. And it seems like your own country.
Shane, your sound is all crackly. I don't know if there's something at your end or if it's just the Trans-Tasman connection.
Sorry.
That's better.
Is that better? I think you could tell I was getting too excited and my energy, that energy.
The fourth industrial revolution has sabotaged your.
And the last thing is actually the election of your own prime minister is one of the benefits of this new way of working, where you can have platforms that can digitally connect people, and they can organise their energy and their movement. And Jacinda used a platform called Nation Builder out of interest, which is another way of how we can begin to think about our own community. So that's where that's a bit of background around that, and that's where we're going with all of that. I've forgotten what the question was. Sorry. After all that explanation.
Just what will the Indigenous Wakanda look like?
Oh, of course, yeah. So. Look, I'll start with the challenge first, right? So, for those who are listening onto this this podcast, or sorry, this webcast, what's it going to mean when the government, if you're an elected member to your representative body, what's it going to mean for you when the government knows more information about your citizens than you do about your own citizens? So, in this country right now, we have a particular challenge around getting people to listen and to engage and have a voice. I suspect all First Nations have that challenge at varying degrees, but that's only going to increase if people don't think they need to talk to you because they know more about your own people than you do, or obviously think they know more about your own people than you do. And so that's really a challenge. And that's, a lot of the academics and a lot of universities right now are engaged in this question of data sovereignty and how we deal with that. That's really, really important. Yeah. The other one, which is really scary, is, we're going to see in the near future the rise of designer babies. Genome editing. And while, I'm not making comment on the ethics of that and the process of that, but the reality is, if we're not included, if our particular characteristics that are special to us aren't included in that suite of options for you to choose from, and it becomes the norm to start choosing how your baby looks because there's particular attributes which are going to make them healthier and live longer and smarter and stronger, etc., then that's got a really big detrimental impact on our identity and our groupings as First Nations people. So that's a real challenge. Another one that's particularly worrying me is, go on, sorry.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to say, that's really interesting, Shane. I hadn't thought about that, actually. This means, because ancestry and future generations is incredibly important to all First Nations peoples. It's hugely pivotal to the way in which Māori see ourselves as our whakapapa and thinking about, 7 generations ahead. So that's a really interesting point.
And the other one is the police state. You know, in the US, they're expecting about 30,000 drones to patrol the US airspace in the next 5 years. That's a 5-year sprint. And you will see that begin in the logistics space around Amazon and others for a need, or so, you know, for a service. And then it won't be long before that need becomes someone else's need, and you'll take that technology and adopt it and adapt it into police enforcement, etc. So when you're already amongst the most incarcerated peoples in the world, and all of a sudden the surveillance has just gone through the roof, that's going to have a particular impact and challenge as well. So what do we do with that? I mean, that's the question, right? You know, we know what's coming, we can see it coming. What are we going to do with it? Well, one of the challenges right now is, you know, we should have been planning for this 5-10 years ago, but the reality is we often don't have the capacity and capability to do that. We're just thinking about what we need right now and how we deal with some of the big issues, which are really human rights issues around life expectancy, etc.
Yeah.
So what we can do is we can make strides into technology as quick as possible. And this is where the IPP becomes really interesting, because we can use markets and market effects to actually drive our supply chains and where we put our energy into the market. Because right now in this country, there's about, I did some math on this, but we're sitting at around 150 people or less that are currently engaged in this space around, and this is a very broad space, you know, just anything related to ITC. It's a very, very broad space.
Yes, and we have the same here, very kind of like low utilisation of Māori in that sector.
So there's the ability to have a network change where you look at bringing people together to create change. So that's always one way to approach it, and I think it's one way we like to come back to. The other way, and I think this is particularly, you know, something the private sector does quite well, is look at sort of the platform model, or how you can be the independent broker and change those policy drivers that connect the two both. And if your policy derivative is to actually get more Indigenous businesses into this particular sector, then you need to look at the friction that currently occurs in there. And if there's an educational friction point, or it's a market-driven friction point around not having not actually having the jobs and cash economy available to you, you've got to really focus on that, and you really, really target and make it a priority and hold people to account.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's all things digital, I think, is absolutely critical to Indigenous peoples for all of the reasons that you've just outlined, you know, to our liberty, to our safety, to our ability to you know, exist and continue and thrive and all those things. And one of the things that COVID has really laid bare, one of a number of things, was the lack of digital equity, and how many of our people, and particularly in South and West Auckland, where my organisation works, which is South Auckland is predominantly Māori and Pasifika, and West Auckland has very large numbers of Māori and Pasifika as well. Just how many people did not have access to an appropriate device, or indeed the internet. So I think there's a kind of dual challenge for us. How do we start to be the designers and the inventors and the owners of the technology, and how are we going to also, you know, kind of tackle that really basic equity question, so that we can actually democratise that within our own population. And, you know, perhaps there's a way of tethering the two together. I think it's an incredibly interesting challenge. So if you could get the answer to me by end of close of business tomorrow, Shane, that would be fabulous. Thank you very much.
No worries. Yeah, good luck with that one. I think the trick is just to make sure that you don't get stepped on by the energy that's going to occur around us. And then that's step one, is just protect yourself and look after yourself. And then step two is, once you've got your balance, then get out there and start fighting and start giving it a go.
Yeah, great. Well, sadly, we've come to the end of our kōrero. It's just been so fantastic, Shane. I love yarning with you, Mob, and hopefully we'll be able to get this Trans-Tasman bubble sorted sooner rather than later, and we can, you know, reconvene in real life, because it's not quite the same.
Not quite.
Not quite the same. Some soon over a pineapple rum. probably. So on behalf of all of us, I'd just like to, convey a huge thank you to Shane for taking the time to share your insights and thoughts. Love to kind of reconnect again around all things digital, interested as well. And to the viewers, next week we will be speaking with Warner Cohen, who is the beauty, brawn and brains behind Hype Project Management. Hype Project Management is also a He Waka Eke Noa business, and they specialise in professional consultancy and project management on construction and infrastructure. Warner will be giving us the rundown on the Crown Infrastructure Program, aka the shovel-ready projects, the New Zealand Upgrade Program, etc., and what this could mean for Māori and Pasifika businesses working in and around the construction and infrastructure sectors, and what can we be doing now, positioning ourselves for those opportunities. So a really important kōrero for lots of our He Waka Eke Noa businesses. So to hear Warner, just tune in to He Waka Eke Noa's Facebook page at 7 o'clock next Thursday, the 14th of May, and hopefully won't have quite the same technical gremlins that we had tonight, but it was all right on the night. And thank you again, Shane.
All right, thank you for having me, and I'll sign off. I'll sign off with a big thank you, and for Fakina, Samuel, and some of the others who are watching this, Wakanda forever.
Yes. Thanks everyone, and until then, kia ora mai tātou, pō Māori e.